Okay. Hello everyone, I am Javi Zagala and my thesis is called Conversations with Mary, a thought experiment on reinterpreting ergonomics and anthropometrics. I'd like to take a more casual approach for this video since I was requested to do a more streamlined version of my thesis defense. You may choose to pause the video to take a look at the slides that I'm showing because there's for sure will be a lot of them. Nevertheless, if you have any questions, go ahead and comment in this video and I'll try to answer them personally when I can. Anyways, let's take a look at this conversation with Mary. This thesis was designed to be at its core a story because stories, like most of them, are made for everyone. But the question is, could it be the same for architecture with everything? The story involved is called a thought experiment. It is a form of fiction that makes use of stories that can reinterpret bodies of knowledge, like architecture. After all, fictional stories, according to anthropologists, are more reliable to human society than numbers in science. This is because it is the same forms of these stories that provide meanings to things like money, corporation, and so much more. Most of the time, when we look at structures, we only see, its form and function. Though the problem lies when we encounter architectures like, let's say, a highway. While it can be argued that it's functional, the same arguments can expose its compromise and actual harm to other significant factors like environment, people, and etc. This thesis proposes to look at all of these factors, user and architecture involved, like small characters of a big story, to make use of their elements and values to create an architecture meant for everything instead of just one, or as it's called here, an ecological architecture. We can do this by using existing literature and the thought experiment to understand not just the architecture to be made, but the characters and relationships throughout and within. Now, the story of this thesis is not based on any whims, and I actually made some story cards here. It is actually more of a sequel to an existing thought experiment, story A and story B. So, the original story tells about a genius named Mary. So Mary lives and has lived her whole life in a black and white world. She is also black and white. Mary studies and becomes a genius in color, knowing all facts through books alone. And then, in this moment of surprise, she encounters a red apple. In this moment, we ask, what does she learn? The thesis or the sequel plays on that question and story like this. So, there's a genius who lived in a black and white room with a desire to learn color, and eventually she sees the same apple. But because of her genius, she doesn't learn anything new. In a plot twist, she realizes herself, her environment, and her books are what make who she is and nothing more. So, instead of asking what does she learn, we ask the genius Mary, what will you make? Now, if we compare the two, story A only focuses on who Mary is and what she means as a person. Therefore, we ask, what does she learn? Story B breaks this down. We look not only at the character Mary, but also her books and her environment, which is her relationship. So now we have three characters here, and from that, we ask, what does she make? So what happens here essentially is we take what we know as people and then architects, like the terms anthropometrics and ergonomics as defined here, to look at things, relationships, and even our reality differently. Doing this makes an ecology being not only a paradigm shift in architecture, but also something that is consumable even by non-architects. Compressing all that story and literature into one framework brings us this tool. And I'd like to think of this tool as the brain of Mary's architect. You have Mary on the top row and how she behaves, and you have her books in the bottom row and what they are to Mary, and they meet in the middle of their relationship, but more on this later. So now we move on to study Mary's mind. This section composes of the literature, though as I am streamlining most of the content, feel free to pause and read. So the first framework helps us understand the relationships in architecture as found in existing literature. You will notice that they are also summarized in priority form, logically placing either the caves, the architecture, as a priority to the cavemen, the humans, or the other way around. That's also how these authors were also chosen. Since there are really only 4 combinations possible for caves and cavemen, it was in the scope to narrow down the 4 authors who expressed how meaning could be translated into the cave or non-human, or to the caveman or human, or vice versa. The framework is also meant to be used for future researches and their own existing literatures to understand further what kind of relationships really exist within the different contexts beyond this thesis. The next one shows the breakdown of their literature. So for example, the top right shows how the meaning of a house could be collective action of migration, like refugees seeking safety in a different location. Another would be biting, mutilation, or contortion of oneself in front of an audience to bring a twisted meaning to the place. Or maybe you would look at humans as a perfect being, like Vitruvius did, maybe to look at houses to follow the human and nothing else, to be the tool for that perfect being. Of course, within that discourse is the actual interaction, which the thesis makes use of habits as a middle point to understand them. So understanding how interactions can be deciphered through their cues, cravings, responses, and rewards. It should also be noted that the cue, craving, response, and reward makes a loop, that being of 2 phases, the situation and the action. You'll notice down the line as I present that interactions are either composed of situations and then the actions, or actions because of a certain situation, and so on and so forth, bringing it to a loop like it is made here. For example, the situation would be a dark room and your eyes dilating to wanting to see, your cue and craving, and the action being the flipping of the light switch and actually experiencing the newly lit room. This, of course, reminds you of the dark room, and hence, for future purposes, brings you back to the loop of doing the same action to fulfill the final reward. This framework then uses that same priority format to describe a human, or Mary, and a non-human. So humans are usually driven by morality and therefore rely on a change of state or circumstance, so which you put as absolute or relative. And non-humans, or the books, are made of qualities either interpreted as tangible real or tangible sensual. Now, all that meat is placed into a linear progression like reading a book. You have your literatures on meanings and definitions of space, human and non-human, what is prioritized, how it can be described as a priority, and if it is rejected or accepted in this relationship. Not necessarily taking them out of the equation, but just putting them on an equal, higher, lower, or perpetual priority between each other. Like the past frameworks, the combination of accept and reject for the relationship only has 4 endings for the thought experiment. So let's put this into work. The target architecture is a townhouse located in Pasig City, but this isn't just any townhouse. This townhouse is the home of my childhood friends. The methodology was adapted to represent communities one has already spent time with. So that is me being the architect of this thesis, ensuring that the choices made for the architecture would be optimal in making them more meaningful and significant for the ecology. It is also meant to be tested in a casual manner, just like any other storytelling. And it is meant to analyze a relationship-centered community through the relationship-centered process. So whilst telling the story, the participants will respond and how they can relate to Mary through their own stories and memories or main values within that community. The tool will then be used in establishing middle grounds to understand the values behind their or even our own relationships. So we're looking here at the choices being made in describing these relationships as the outcomes of ecologies. And you can see here there are 4 endings to those outcomes. The results being, for the micro relationship, egoist that accepts only the human, altruist that accepts only the non-human, equal that accepts both, and perpetual that rejects both for the micro relationship. And for the macro relationship, bigger picture, public, semi-public, semi-private, and private, either prioritizing the inner relationship or the outer relationship. So of course, as an architectural thesis, observations were made to gather the character-defining elements of the townhouse involved. Apart from so, the group was also asked to map significant memories throughout the floor plan. Mapping these out, we found the findings are that most of the equalist or true values were found in semi-public spaces, as it were used for a family/visitor space. Perpetualist spaces show hints of privacy, but every now and then they're still able to foster visitors or even family members to change that dynamic of the area. Egoist memories were located usually at the back of the house where most of my childhood friends grew their whole childhood lives in. Therefore, there's a lot of nostalgia there and a lot of development just for that one person. And lastly, altruists usually target the hottest place in the area, lengthiest travel, and the last possible place to have memories, as it's usually crowded by things, not visitors, as well as a really bulk storage. As I'm listening to the stories, I am using the tool and their initial descriptions to see how their relationships are prioritized. These make up the versions of their Mary and how their architecture can be accessed to enhance their relationship. These make new metrics of relationships. For example, maybe they are the type to go out of their way for their things, or if they always have them, or maybe they are okay with just being at level with them. As they describe this further, they make use of terms that describe making or breaking a habit interaction. And with these terms, I can establish a middle ground in understanding how they approach and use the relationship. For this instance, maybe the bookshelves may be singular or massive to highlight the bulk as much as possible for the interaction. These make new ergonomics for the relationship, systems that the relationship can rely on in the architecture. And lastly, we make use of the same process for the individual approach. This analyzes the relationships outside their own, as well as the value and priority of what is involved in the bigger picture. So we're focusing on not just their relationship as an individual, but relationship to relationship as well. So at this point, I asked the jurors or the audience what kind of Mary they could be. But since this is a video format, I'll just focus on showing you the results that my childhood friends and how they manifested in the architecture. Each of these could have their own discourse, so you may pause to take a closer look while I can just give you the highlights. But this slide talks about peripersonal architecture, that being the resulting architecture actually manifests beyond the relationship concern and to the environment. One of which being the perpetualist book hammock. So imagine a hammock made out of books, but if you remove book from the hammock, you cannot lie down there anymore. It should be whole. Therefore, you would have to adjust to that new hole, and so on and so forth, the other way around. And this one is more personal, that being a more singular use in the nature of the relationship. One of the standout recorded results was how one of the respondents treated shoes as a means of comfort over the actual look. She didn't really care how it looked after given her a few days. She just what mattered to her most is how much it worked for her and what it did to get her from one place to another. So that leans more to the egoist or private priority, where the individual is more prioritized than the non-human. I summarized all these findings in a flight card that looks like this, showing a summary of what is defined and how these relationships can be measured, or how these relationships could be adapted into architecture. And then finally, the final architecture, which is Mary's House of Relationships. So this is Mary's House of Relationships, a renovation of a childhood home and its relationships of the ecology within. So in the middle, you would have anecdotes that highlight the significant values and character defining elements of the original home, and then perspectives and floor plan to supplement. So the first floor makes up of the ecolist, which is the semi-public space that connects all houses, not just of one unit, also to the other. Second floor makes the egoist, the most private, nostalgic area for the respondents, since a lot of them grew up in this part of the house. Here's the perpetualist slide, a falls, always adjusting area of the house. The master's room were here, so a lot of visitors would come in and come go, even though there were a lot of valuables inside. So there's a lot of adjustment there. And third floor is where most of the programs meet, making less and less room for the altruist, which was the last program. And the last floor being the altruist floor, being the most uncomfortable but in character version of this part of the townhouse. This is the elevation of the house that preserves the character defining elements of the original, but now in line with the thesis. And since a lot of the stories provided by the respondents were memories of what happened inside, this one kind of bloomed outwards for the exterior. Therefore, it was an interior to exterior process. But using the same tool, you can always flip it. Instead of asking Mary and books first, you can always ask about the relationship first and how the individuals are affected, so on and so forth. More elevation showing the location of the perpetualist, altruist, and egoist areas. Another elevation showing the equalist. This is the roof. And this is the section that shows how all of those versions of Marys interact with each other. This is the other side. You would notice also here, the perpetualists have privacy slats, and this is in line with the perpetualists always adjusting to whether a semi-public or a private place they can open and close for that new master's bedroom of theirs. You'll see that the perpetualist has options to go up and down to different parts of the house or move their furniture fixtures to update their room to how they see fit. The egoist next to the equalist, that being equalist with the whole architecture, and egoist intruding the rest of the architecture in order to benefit itself and its raised bed platform. And lastly, the altruist that has the smallest space next to a skylight, which is uncomfortable but very in character for this version of Mary. Other side, and this is the one that shows that townhouses are also physically connected through the equalist part, very in line with the Mary character. Now here's a close-up of the base section showing the rotary instruments for the egoist bed. And what's very interesting about here is that circular shape houses Mary no matter what. While when you rotate it a certain way, the books will fall over, but Mary will always have a spot to lie down on, therefore being in line with the egoist. And lastly, the very in-character, inconvenient sky shelves for the altruist, where the altruist has to go out of their way into this really hot skylight just to get this one book and bring it back to her place so that she could read it, therefore prioritizing books over Mary herself. So that concludes my presentation. So what the thesis concludes is that yes, architecture can benefit from the relationship of everything in ecology through their qualities, function, and organization. Another is yes, you can make architectural concepts through the use of thought experiments. And given so, you can make sequels of existing literature to reanalyze how architecture can work for relationships inside and outside the usual paradigms. I recommend, this thesis also recommends future testing with more focus groups and more diverse backgrounds. The use of childhood friends as respondents were to ensure, again, a strong bond between the architect and the respondees to make the best possible architecture. So the same could be recommended for, let's say, a tribal group that needs a certain architecture. Instead of giving them a social house, you could use this tool to understand them further and give them a more meaningful architecture. Another recommendation is to branch out beyond residential architecture and also to different aspects of the architectural process like form, site, or urban planning. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. I hope I was able to explain it as the best I can. And thank you very much for watching this presentation, and I'll see you around. Bye.